I recently read The Ideal Team Player by Patrick Lencioni, and it is the number one book I've ever read on hiring and knowing when to fire somebody. And it explains it through a story. And every book that this guy's written many books. I recommend all of them, and all of them are fables. And that's the best way that I've been able to learn, is through the story. And the story goes like this: there's this guy. He's in Silicon Valley. Things are going pretty stressful over there, and so he decides that he wants to take some time off and just go and work for his uncle's company. Well, a couple months in, his uncle ends up getting sick, and his uncle says, "Hey, you need to take over the company. You have the experience with Silicon Valley. You can take over my construction business." And right at that time, they had so many projects going on, and they just barely got into 2 huge projects. And if they weren't able to hire 80 new people in the next 100 days, then they were going to go out of business because they wouldn't have enough people to actually do the jobs. And so he's put in this very stressful situation. Well, he asked the other 2 people, like, "Hey, I haven't seen how the business runs. Like, how do we hire people? What do we look for?" And they're like, "Honestly, like, we try to look for people that are honest, but sometimes we just have to hire people. We have to look for people that have good morals, but sometimes we just have to hire people because nobody else is available." And he's like, "What are we talking about here?" He's like, "Yeah, and just to let you know, turnover is really high. We have to fire a lot of people because they just don't fit with the company, and their standards aren't high enough." And he's like, "What?" And so he goes on like this quest of trying to figure out, like, who is their ideal team player for their team. And it takes him a while, but he finds out these 3 principles: humble, hungry, and smart, being people smart. And with these 3 principles, he finds out when he hires somebody and they're prideful, meaning they're not teachable, they don't take advice, you can't work with them. They think that they're better than you. And so he's like, "I can't hire that person." And when he found somebody who was humble, but then they were willing to take advice, but they weren't hungry enough, they didn't have the desires, weren't self-motivated, then no matter what he did with them, he couldn't persuade them enough to do the work because they didn't have that inner hunger about them. And then number 3, people smarts, being able to work with other people on your team, being able to communicate with them. He figured out that when he found a person that was able to communicate with other people on their team, that other people liked working with them, then the team overall did a lot better. And he figured out at the end of the story that if anybody was missing even one of these 3 principles, if they were hungry and if they were humble and hungry, but they weren't people smart, then they weren't going to get along with other people on the team. Or if they were hungry and people smart, but they weren't humble, they were super prideful, they wouldn't listen to other people, then you also couldn't work with them. And if they just had 1 out of the 3, it wouldn't work either. And so after reading this book, I'm like, man, I really need to find out, like, what are our principles? What is our humble, hungry, and smart principles? Now, these 3 apply to business in general, and that's what he says, that every person, regardless of the company, you need to have those 3 principles. So those are like the baseline. And then on top of that, what are your company values as well? After reading this book, definitely 5 stars. Have to recommend it to you. You can read it or you can listen to it. And once you do, please let me know how it goes, because I got a ton out of it and I'd love to talk about it with you.